All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercoaster Words. Chapter 50, 3rd Year, Philomena Pettigrew. Friday, the 21st of December, 1973. Sirius spent the weeks leading up to Christmas on the edge of a knife. He felt distinctly unbalanced, waiting for some indication as to what his family expected of him, if they expected anything from him anymore. He held his breath every morning when the post arrived, waiting for a letter, a howler, a note, something from his parents to acknowledge the fact that he still existed. At the Slytherin table, Reg received owls almost every day. Nothing came for Sirius. He became convinced that this was some new form of torture that his mother had concocted, the waiting, that is. It wasn't like he wanted a letter, he just needed to know whether he could safely go to the Potters. The events of the previous Christmas were all too fresh in his mind, unearthed by the twinkling lights and the scent of pine. Knowing his family, Sirius half expected them to demand him to return home for Christmas, after an entire term of ignoring him, just to make him miserable. He had already decided that they couldn't make him go, he'd just stay at Hogwarts if he had to, but at least he would finally know, one way or the other, what to expect once classes ended. Another part of him, which he tried to stifle, the part that made his skin crawl every time he saw the way the Slytherins looked at him, the way they laughed and whispered, wanted a letter for other reasons, neurotic reasons, wanted something to shove in their faces, something he could wave in front of Reg and say, see, I'm still... Sirius didn't let himself think it. He balanced on the edge of the knife, certain only that whatever his parents did, it would be done with the intent to draw blood. It wasn't until the day before the break began, at breakfast, when an owl swooped over his head and dropped a single, tightly folded note in front of his plate. Sirius's heart stuttered, as though someone was squeezing it. His friends were watching, so he kept his expression blank as he unfolded the paper. It was short, only one line, scrawled in his father's cramped handwriting. To Mr. S.O. Black III. You will not be required at the family home this winter break. Do as you please. Signed, Orion Black. James, who was reading over his shoulder, immediately let out a cheer. Yes! He nearly knocked over his porridge. Might even get you for the summer at this rate. What about Regulus? Remus asked quietly. His eyes were very dark. For a moment it made Sirius feel transparent, as though Lupin was seeing right through him and into the fist in his chest. Oh, little Prince Reg is going home for Christmas, he snorted, shoving the note into his pocket. It's just me they've disinvited. Good. Perfect. Excellent. They don't care. I don't care. Sirius hadn't actually spoken to his brother about his plan for the break, but he didn't need to. It was obvious that Reg was delighted in turning to himself into the perfect little heir that their parents had always wanted. In fact, he was probably thrilled to know that Sirius wasn't welcome home over the holidays. He would probably go back to his room that night and laugh about it with all his little friends, wearing that stupid, smug grin that made his face look all wrong. Sirius didn't care. If Regulus wanted to kiss up to their parents and spout nonsense about blood purity and sit around sweating in those awful dress robes, then that was fine. It was his choice. He'd made that very clear. And besides, Sirius had other, more important things to worry about. Namely, beginning the Marauders Animagi project. Remus had said yes. Of course he'd said yes. Sirius always knew he would, after consulting the thick sheafs of parchment that held their research. He had also secured permission to stay with the Potters over Christmas, and since Sirius's family had confirmed that they didn't care, he would be going too. Peter, of course, would be just up the road, making this the perfect time for the four of them to begin work in earnest. There would be far less oversight outside of Hogwarts, as Fleamont and Euphemia seemed to operate under the assumption that their son could do no wrong, and would therefore never suspect James of breaking the law. That night, as they were all packing, Sirius covertly showed Remus the gifts he'd bought for the Potters, a golden watch chain and a shimmery garnet brooch. He had no idea if they were the sort of gifts that they'd like, but he'd been too anxious to ask James for help. Remus felt safer. Do you think they're okay? He asked, feeling a bit nervous and awkward. My family's shit at doing presents, so I never really know. Black, Sirius, they're bloody perfect. Don't worry. Remus smiled gently, and Sirius felt a comforting warmth spread through his chest. James was usually the best at cheering him up, but assurances felt different coming from Moony. Remus didn't dole out praise unless he really, really meant it. Saturday the 22nd of December, 1973. Unlike the previous year, the full moon fell on the beginning of the month, which meant all 4 marauders were able to board the Hogwarts Express with the rest of the student body. Mary and Marlene came to sit in their carriage, which made Sirius slightly uncomfortable. Mary still hadn't said anything either way about what had happened in the library, and he had no idea what she was thinking. Were they still friends? Luckily, the rest of the group kept up a steady stream of chatter, making it easy for Sirius to avoid any awkward confrontations. "Did you get your essay back from Ferox?" Marlene asked Remus, frowning. "I only barely got an acceptable mark. My mum's going to go mental if I don't come back with better results this year." Yeah, I did okay," Remus mumbled, glancing away. Sirius raised an eyebrow, amused. He knew for a fact that Lupin hadn't got anything less than outstanding on any of his Care of Magical Creatures essays. The other marauders teased him about it. "We'll bring back the study club after Christmas, right?" Mary piped up. "Lily's up for it. Don't worry, Miles. You'll be fine." "Sounds good." Remus nodded, seeming relieved that the focus had shifted from his grades. Sirius didn't understand what the point was of getting top marks if you weren't going to brag about it, but Lupin had always seemed to dislike any attention of any kind. "Mooney's joined a club without us," Sirius wailed, collapsing onto James's shoulder. He mock-wept dramatically. "He's a big boy now," James consoled him. "They grow up so fast." "Oh, piss off." Remus rolled his eyes, grinning. "They have a slug club for poshos like you." "You can study with us if you want, Sirius," Mary said, batting her eyelashes and leaning a bit closer to him. He blinked, not sure what he was supposed to do or respond. Did he have to say yes? He didn't actually want to join their silly little study club. He had much better things to do with his time. Luckily, Peter had chosen that moment to chomp down on an earwax-flavoured Barty Bots every flavoured bean, retching horribly and saving Sirius from having to answer. When they pulled into King's Cross, Sirius felt a sharp stab of fear. He tried to remain nonchalant as he glanced out of the window, scanning for any sign of his parents. Despite the letter, the irrational fear remained that they would somehow find him, that this had all been some elaborate ruse to get his guard down, that they would swoop in the moment he set foot off the train and drag him away. James seemed to notice his hesitation. He didn't say anything, but he was purposefully slow gathering his things, and by the time they made it off the train, half the families had already cleared out. Sirius's parents were nowhere to be seen, nor was Reg. They had left without him. Good, great, fantastic. The only thing Sirius felt was relief. They apparated to the Potters. Mrs. Potter took Remus first, then came back for him. When he arrived on the front doorstep, Lupin was gripping the banister and looking a bit peaky. Sirius poked his side. "All right there, Mooney?" Remus groaned. "I never want to do that again." He laughed as Mrs. Potter ushered them all inside. Sirius remembered his first time apparating. He'd been so dizzy afterwards that he'd had to lie down. All things considered, Remus was doing pretty well. Inside, the house was just as festive and cosy as Sirius remembered it. Mrs. Potter sent the trunks flying up to their rooms, sweeping them past the twinkling lights and sprinklings of holly in the kitchen, where she set a kettle to boil and began slicing thick pieces of homemade Madeira cake. Sirius settled down next to Remus, feeling warm from head to toe as he sipped his mug of tea and talked with the Potters about their term so far. To all 3 boys' dismay, there had been no snow this winter. Instead, the sky outside was a wash of dark, grey storm clouds that poured torrents of rain onto the earth. As the sky grew darker, the storm thickened, clouds growing heavier and angrier until they were spitting lightning and hailstones against the house's window panes. Since going outside wasn't an option, the boys remained in the living room, playing games under the Christmas tree and toasting tea cakes over the fire. Sirius knew he should be blissfully happy, munching on the homemade sweets and breathing in the clove and chestnut scent that permeated the air, but he found that he was unable to fully relax. The Potters' home, which had previously been an untouchable sanctuary, felt somehow tainted this year. He kept glancing towards the hallway, remembering how his mother had torn inside the house like a knife parting flesh. Sirius was jumpy, unsettled, on edge. He knew it was stupid, but some part of him was sure that letting his guard down fully would only open him to some unknown horror. He tried to focus on their game of gobstones as Mrs. Potter reviewed her list for the coming celebrations, chattering absent-mindedly. "We've got a few more people this year," she told them, scanning the hovering sheets of parchment. Some friends from the old days, and some newer acquaintances. Only just have enough room for all of you." Sirius smiled unconsciously, soothed by the tender happiness in her voice. And then, suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. He stiffened, entire body tensing as if in anticipation for a blow. His body was frozen on the carpet. He jerked his head first towards the empty entryway, then to Mrs. Potter. Sirius could feel the sticky glut of fear gumming in his mouth, coating the back of his tongue. It was bitter. Mrs. Potter abandoned her hovering list to answer the door, letting in a cold breeze. All three boys sat silently in the living room, listening. For a moment, Sirius was sure that he heard the familiar snarl of his mother's voice, a woman beginning to speak. But it wasn't her. This voice was higher, younger, more fragile. She sounded upset, as though she'd been crying. Sirius could hear Mrs. Potter murmuring soothing words, though her voice was too low to make out exactly what was being said. "Boys!" she called from the hallway. Sirius stood robotically, following Remus and James. His heart was still pounding. Mrs. Potter stood in the kitchen doorway. There was a younger woman behind her, long blonde hair curtaining her face, head in her hands. "What's up, Mum?" James craned his neck, trying to see. "It's getting late. You all better go to bed. Philly's staying the night. I'm afraid we've got no room left. Sirius, you wouldn't mind sharing with James tonight, dear?" Philly. That name rang a bell, but Sirius couldn't put his finger on who it was. No one he'd met, he was sure. "We can all share," James suggested quickly. "Everyone else is arriving tomorrow anyway. Might as well all just bunk up together." Mrs. Potter nodded and summoned the house elf. Sirius and James were already quite used to sharing his room, and it was more than big enough for all three of them. The walls were plastered with familiar Gryffindor banners, making Sirius feel as though they were back at Hogwarts. Also decorating the walls, James had mounted every broom he'd ever owned, and although he was turning 14 in a few months, his shelves were still packed with old toys and children's books. Sirius flopped down on the enormous bed, hung with red velvet drapes that were currently pulled back, another similarity to their dorm at Hogwarts. Gully had sent up 2 single beds for Sirius and Remus, but Sirius already knew he wasn't going to be using his. "Who was that?" Remus asked, joining them on James's bed once they had all changed into their pyjamas. "Philomena," James said. "Pete's sister." "Of course," Sirius thought, smacking himself mentally. James had told them about Philomena during their nightly meetings. Her decision to go on to some muggle school after finishing her newts had been a huge source of drama for the Pettigrew family. "What's she doing here?" "I think she's been arguing with Pete's folks. They don't like her going to Muggle University, and—" he lowered his voice. "Dad says she's got a Muggle boyfriend." "Really?" Sirius gasped, unable to hide his surprise. He'd never met Philomena, of course, but knowing Peter, he had a hard time believing that a Pettigrew could do something so rebellious, at least without being told to. The only other person that Sirius knew that had dated a Muggle was Andromeda. "Yeah, and you know what Mum's like." James nudged his arm. "Loves taking in strays." Christmas Eve, 1973. Philomena sat with them at breakfast, but she wasn't very interesting company. She mostly stared into space, eyes watery, as if she were perpetually about to burst into tears. Privately, Sirius thought she was being a bit dramatic. His family had kicked him out for Christmas too, and he wasn't crying about it. Besides, spending the holidays with the Potters was surely a much more fun way to spend it than with the Pettigrews. To be fair, he didn't actually know how serious Philomena's situation was. James thought it would be rude to pry. He had explained to them in whispers that Peter had always looked up to his older sister, apparently. She had been quite the goody two-shoes while at Hogwarts. Her parents were expecting her to marry her pure-blood boyfriend, and it came as quite a shock when she broke up with him and moved out to attend a Muggle university. At first, they thought it was a simple act of teenage rebellion, a phase that would only pass in a few months, and she'd get bored. But now, with 3 years gone, her family was growing increasingly worried about her ties to Muggles, especially in the current political climate. In fact, the Pettigrews were so upset with Peter's older sister that once they found out she was staying at the Potters, they forbid Pete from leaving the house. The other marauders had to make do with sending letters back and forth, which, Although it meant putting their ANDROMEDA plans on hold, Sirius had to admit he did not entirely mind. Surprisingly, James didn't seem to mind much either. He was clearly delighted by Philomena's presence, fawning over her and making as much of a fool of himself as he did around Evans. Sirius found it both mildly amusing and mildly off-putting. Although Philomena was certainly much prettier than Peter, with her pixie-like features and her delicate freckles, the resemblance was still there in the straw-coloured hair and the way she seemed to do nothing but mope around all day. After watching his friend offer tea to the clearly uninterested girl for a fourth time that evening, Sirius had had enough. Oh, bloody hell, Potter. She's just a girl. They were beginning to get ready for bed, pulling pyjamas and toothbrushes out of their trunks. "I'm just being nice," James said defensively. "Nothing wrong with being nice to my mate's sister." "What would Evans say?" Sirius asked coyly, grinning when James blushed tomato red. "She'd be glad someone's taken his mind off her," Remus drawled, eyes sparkling mischievously from where he was reclined on his camp bed. "You can talk, Black." James gave him a shove. "What's going on between you and Mary?" "MacDonald?" Sirius shrugged, nonchalant. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, come on," James groaned. "Tell us. Have you snogged her or what?" Sirius kept the coy smile, though his pulse kicked with nerves. "No. Kissed her, though." He felt much better about this split-second decision in the library now that he had a chance to brag about it to his friends. Clearly, James was expecting snogging, but Sirius had done the correct thing. "Oh, how scandalous, Black!" James threw a pillow at him, and Sirius chucked it back, initiating a fierce wrestling match that ended with both of them breathless and grinning in the rumpled blankets. James laughed as they stood, slapping him on the back. Sirius glanced over to Remus, who was ignoring them, staring into space with his lip poking out as he pondered some serious thought with his enormous brain. He waved his toothbrush in front of his friend's face, sing-songing, "Hello, Moony, Earth to Moony." Sirius blinked, jerking back, and frowned up at him. "Yeah, all right, I'm coming." He picked up his own toothbrush, and the three of them made their way down the hall to the bathroom, where James made faces in the mirror that had them all choking on their toothpaste with laughter. Sirius went to bed that night, warmed by a smothering ember of happiness. For now, everything was exactly how it should be. Chapter 51. Third Year, Andromeda. Christmas Day, 1973. There were no more conversations about girls in the next morning. The marauders were far too busy opening their presents. The living room became a massacre of wrapping paper and bows, gutted boxes and empty bags. The Potters had outdone themselves. Even Euphemia perked up when she saw a present with her name on it under the tree, although her eyes still looked a bit misty. Mr. and Mrs. Potter were delighted with Sirius's gifts. Euphemia cooed over the brooch and called him a dear boy, which made Sirius feel bashful and happy, and like he had a lump in his throat, all at once. He received a wealth of snacks and practical jokes from his friends, and a lovely set of enchanted quills from the Potters, who insisted that he write to them any time and treat James's owl as his own. "He already does, Mum, believe me," James said around a mouthful of biscuits. Sirius elbowed him in the ribs, and he laughed. After opening his gift from the Potters, Sirius began to search through the remaining presents for Andromeda's loopy scrawl. He knew that she'd been awfully busy with the new baby, but still, she'd never missed a Christmas before. As the final gifts were unwrapped, leaving only crumpled paper, his heart sank. There was nothing from his cousin. Sirius knew that he shouldn't be upset with Andromeda, but he couldn't stop the wash of loneliness. He'd sent her a card. Since she'd been kicked out, he'd been her only family. This Christmas, he'd thought that she would be his. But apparently, no one in his family cared about him, not even his favourite cousin. He tried to stifle his dark mood, knowing that he should be grateful and happy surrounded by his friends. Still, James seemed to pick up on the fact that there was something wrong. "What up were you?" he asked, speaking once more with his mouth full, this time around a bite of scrambled eggs. Sirius shrugged. "Nothing from Andromeda," he said, poking his own breakfast unenthusiastically. "I didn't think I'd get a present or anything, now that she's got the baby. But maybe a card. I sent her one." James swallowed, putting a comforting hand on his shoulder. Owl might just be flying late. You know how the post is this time of year. Sirius mustered up a smile, trying to feel reassured. James was probably right. He wasn't sure if Andromeda had forgotten him, or stopped caring about him. She was his family. "Didn't stop the rest of your family from forgetting you, though, did it?" whispered a small, mean voice in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded very much like his own. Sirius shook it off. He was determined not to let himself ruin the holiday. If he wasn't careful, he'd end up moping around just as much as Philomena. The minute breakfast was done, all three boys headed outside to test James's brand new broom. Sirius had brought his own broom with him, and Mr. Potter offered Remus James's old one. "Yeah, have it if you want, Moony." James nodded eagerly. "To keep." "Thanks," Remus said, not looking very enthusiastic, as he accepted the gift. He held the broomstick gingerly, as if worried that it might bite him. They spent the rest of the afternoon flying blissfully through the cold winter air. Well, Sirius and James flew. Remus just hovered, barely half an inch from the ground, and read his book. The other boys didn't mind. Eventually, they made a game of seeing who could break Moony's concentration first, executing sharp dives and showy loops that had them sailing past him. His ability to ignore them was quite impressive, although Sirius supposed that he had a few years of practice. Just before lunchtime, Gully called them inside. The house smelled delicious, roast beef with all the trimmings. But Mrs. Potter insisted that they wash their hands first. She sent them upstairs, waving her wooden spoon and letting them know that Gully had set out their things. They changed quickly, washing up and rushing downstairs with growling stomachs. James pushed ahead, leaping over the last few steps as though he'd done it 1,000 times, which he probably had, and Sirius and Remus behind as they reached towards the kitchen. They were still on the stairs when a loud, familiar crack sounded outside. Sirius froze involuntarily. Fear was a fist around his heart, squeezing, locking up his entire body. "My mother," he thought. There was a sudden warm pressure on his shoulder. It was Moony. He'd reached out, as if to say, "I'm here." A hand, firm and grounding, unknotting the tension in Sirius's chest, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Sirius looked down at the fingers, faintly scared, faintly scarred, ghostly patterns that caught in the light. He felt a sudden surge of affection for his friend, and turned, smiling gratefully up at Remus. The bell rang, drawing their attention. Remus withdrew his hand, and Sirius released a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He could still feel the warm points of contact, where the fingers had pressed gently into his shoulder. It felt nice. Really nice. They made their way to the bottom of the stairs as James opened the door. There was a couple in the entryway, a young man and a woman, arms cradling a small bundle. The man was stocky and a bit shorter than her, with a mess of fair curls. She was slender, sharper, her own curls cascading down her back. Next to him, Remus sucked in a harsh breath. "No," Sirius gasped, already throwing himself forward, his face split into a giddy grin. "Sirius!" Andromeda shouted, voice bright with joy. She passed the baby, to her husband, and pulled him into a bear hug, squeezing him so tightly that he could barely breathe. Sirius felt as though he might burst from happiness. It had been years since he'd actually got to see his cousin in person. "She's a good surprise, then?" Mrs. Potter asked, looking very pleased with herself as she entered the hallway. She shook Ted's hand, cooing over the baby. "You did this!" Sirius blinked, feeling the dangerous sting of tears in his eyes. No one had ever done something so nice for him. "Effie was kind enough to invite us," Ted said. His voice was a pleasant baritone, his eyes sparkling with laughter. "Pleased to meet you, Sirius. Nice to meet someone in Andromeda's family." Come in, Mrs. Potter urged, scooting them towards the dining room. Sirius followed, unable to stop smiling, with his cousin's arm slung around his shoulder. Andromeda was just as he remembered. Well, she was older, and her hair was longer, and there were fine creases in the corners of her eyes. But she still had the same boisterous laugh, the same sharp sense of humour, the same warmth that felt so alien compared to the icy demeanour of her sisters. Ted was clearly mad for her. He orbited her like a planet, unconsciously, moving when she moved. Every time Andromeda smiled at him, he stared up at her with a blissful expression someone might wear while basking in the sunlight. Sirius had never seen two people so obviously in love. It was almost frightening to watch. Their daughter, Dora, Nymphadora, Sirius had teased his cousin mercilessly about the decision in his letters, amused that of all of the black traits that she should inherit, it would be the penchant for ridiculous names, was adorable. Andromeda had already told him that the baby was a metamorphicus, but he was still a bit surprised the first time he saw her wispy hair change from a bright green to a blue. It kept changing colour throughout the dinner, and Sirius found himself secretly envying the girl. Just imagine everything you could get away with if you could change your appearance at will. Aside from Andromeda and her family, they were joined by several other guests for the dinner. An old family friend of the Potters. The table was full with laughter and chatter, and Sirius thought it was by far the most cheerful dinner party he had ever attended. A toast, Mr. Potter stood, a bit tipsily. He raised his glass at the end of the meal. To friends, old and new. To the Potters, Andromeda responded, lifting her own glass. Protectors of outcasts and defenders of the black sheeps everywhere. There was a wave of laughter, punctuated by the clinking of glasses. I think I must be the most outcast, Sirius declared. I am a Gryffindor, after all. To Gryffindor, Mr. Potter called out from the end of the table. This was met by hearty cheers from all the Gryffindors present, which admittedly was more than half the table. Andromeda narrowed her eyes at Sirius, smiling with a challenge. Think so, little cousin? Try marrying a non-relative. I'll have to, Sirius shot back, as Gully began to clear their plates, and Mrs. Potter bustled into the kitchen for the Christmas pudding. After Sissy's wedding, there aren't going to be any black women left. Andromeda grinned impishly. There's Dora. Excuse me, Ted covered his daughter's ears. Could we please get her through her first Christmas before arranging a betrothal? I'm teasing, Andromeda leaned over and kissed his cheek. Then the babies. Dora can marry anyone she likes when she's old enough, and I can say with absolute certainty that it won't be anyone at this table. This elected another wave of laughter, and some of the older women leaned over to coo at the baby. As soon as the pudding was extinguished, served and eaten, crackers pulled and terrible jokes read out, the party adjourned into the living room. The ladies moved upstairs to change into their party dresses, and Mr. Potter settled into his chair and pulled out his pipe. Ted followed his wife upstairs to put Dora down for a nap, and the three of the marauders made themselves comfortable on the carpet. They began a game of snap, which was interrupted by Darius, and Mr. Potter decided that everyone should play a round of charades. As the evening drew on, more guests began to arrive. Soon the house was bursting with people, rooms buzzing and with a steady hum of chatter. Sirius and Andromeda took up post by the record player, appointing themselves as DJs, scouring their combined record collections to introduce the partygoers to wonders of Muggle music. They blasted Slade's Merry Christmas Everybody and I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day by Wizzard. Sirius was an acolyte, proselytizing to anyone who strayed within 5 feet of him. They're actually called Wizzard, though, and just listen to it. He was so earnest that Andromeda couldn't stop giggling, clutching her stomach as if she was gasping for breath. A little ways away, Philomena had actually stopped moping about for once and was showing James how to twist. The younger boy looked vaguely dazed and incredibly pleased, but although James was a picture of poise and grace on his broomstick, he was actually solid on the ground and had 2 left feet. After a few stumbling mishaps, Philomena gave up the half-hearted dance lessons, and the two drifted over towards the record player. As the chorus came on, all 4 of them belted at the top of their lungs. Well, I wish it could be Christmas every day. Sirius looked around for Remus as the song ended. He wanted to put something on by Bowie next, and he needed help choosing between Changes and Suffragette City. Also, James had slung his arms around Sirius's shoulders, and for some reason it was making him think about when Remus had touched him earlier. His fingers were longer than James's, grip firmer. Where had he slipped off to? Who are you looking for? Andromeda spoke directly into his ear, making him jump. She laughed and straightened back up, ruffling his hair. No one. He passed Changes to her to put it on next. Just Moony. "Ah, your quiet friend. He seems nice." Sirius snorted, smiling absently. "He's not." Andromeda laughed. Philomena pulled James back out to try another round of dancing, leaving Sirius and his cousin in relative privacy as the party milled around them. When he turned back around, she was smiling at him fondly. "What?" She shook her head, smiling. "Nothing. Just, I'm glad you have such good friends." Her eyes flicked across his face, studying him. "You seem happy." Sirius looked away, shrugging. Andromeda tried to do this sometimes in her letters, talk about feelings. He knew she was just trying to look out for him. She'd had a rough time of it when everything went down with their family, and there hadn't been anyone to ask if she was okay. Sirius understood that. He understood that it came from a place of love, but it made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to talk about how he was doing. He preferred to think about his feelings as little as possible. "Yeah," he said lightly. "They're good mates." "Great. Yeah, that's good." Sirius could tell she was gearing up to say something, though he wasn't sure what. He waited, nervous, until his cousin finally spoke. Do you ever see Sissy around school?" She was trying to keep her voice light, casual, but Sirius recognized the spark of desperation in her eyes. He hated it. He hated when she asked this of him, and hated that he was the only one she could ask. "Sometimes," he shrugged. "Not much. She hasn't really been speaking to me since summer." After a moment, "Neither of them have." Andromeda nodded, smile still stretching tightly across her face. She knew all about what had happened the previous summer. Sirius had written to her while it was happening. "Yeah," she murmured. "Yeah, I suppose she wouldn't. Stubborn one, that Sissy." Sirius knew that Andromeda still tried to write letters to her sisters, sometimes. He was pretty sure that she had invited them to Dora's baby shower. He also knew that they never wrote back. There was a heavy pause when Andromeda spoke again, in a low voice. "Does she seem happy? Or is she doing okay, at least?" Sirius's mouth opened helplessly. He didn't know what to say. Yeah, I think so." The hungry look in Andromeda's eyes made him uncomfortable. He stared at the ground. "I dunno. I mean, I think she's going to marry that Malfoy bloke now. So I think she's happy about that." "Okay," Andromeda nodded. "Yeah. Thanks, Sirius." She reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. "I mean it." When he looked up, she was smiling again, features settling back into their normal patterns. Come on, we've got to pick out what to put on next." She winked at him, and the tension between them unspooled. "No more family talk tonight, I promise." "All right," he grinned back. "Where'd that Slade record go?" It wasn't long before they were laughing again. The twinkling lights, the happy chatter, the sheer vibrance that it was Christmas at the Potters made it impossible for anyone to stay gloomy for very long. Andromeda waved her wand like a baton and led everyone together in a chorus. Chapter 52. Third Year, Confidence. Saturday, the 5th of January, 1974. The weather outside was just as gloomy as Sirius's mood. Rain pounded like fists against the windows of the Hogwarts Express, turning the hills outside into a misty wash of grey and green. "Feels rubbish going back to school, doesn't it?" Sirius muttered, sulking against the corner of their carriage. No one responded. His friends didn't quite seem to know what had gotten him into his dark mood. Next to him, Remus sighed, and then asked politely, "How was your Christmas, Pete?" "Okay," Peter responded, voice flat. "Thanks for the sweets." "Seen my broom?" James asked, trying to bring some cheer back into the car. It half worked. Peter perked up as he pulled the broom from the luggage rack, shifting to get a better look. But Sirius, who had seen quite enough of the gift over the break, remained staring stubbornly out of the window. Remus shifted, turning back to the large book in his lap. Sirius felt very aware of the movement. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Moony's fingers turning the pages. This was a new development, this strange awareness, and it was a rather unwelcome one. Ever since Remus had reached out and gripped his shoulder, Sirius had kept getting distracted by the smallest of movements. He'd find his eyes following Remus's fingers as he adjusted his tie, or realise that he was staring as Remus reached over and began to fiddle absent-mindedly with the sleeve of his robes. When Remus had sat down next to him on the train, their knees had knocked together, and Sirius had only realised a few seconds later that he was holding his breath. It was driving Sirius insane. It wasn't like the brief touch had been anything unusual. James grabbed his shoulders all the time. But it was different with James. He was always reaching out to grab your arm or wrestle you into a headlock or poke your side. And Remus didn't. Sirius had never really thought about it before, but after Christmas he'd realised that he could probably count on one hand the number of times that Remus had actually reached out and touched him. And that was weird, right? Sirius was pretty sure it was weird. He was pretty sure that's why he kept thinking about it, because they were best mates. But Remus was still so withdrawn, and he only reached out and gripped your shoulder like that if it really meant something. But that was all it was. Just another one of Remus's many incoherencies, which Sirius was only pondering out of boredom. It was just strange because it was so different from how things were with him and James. And that was the only reason he kept thinking about it. Remus drummed his fingers against the pages of his book, drawing Sirius's eye like a magnet. It was a relief when a quiet knock came on the carriage door, pulling Sirius out of the confusing turn his thoughts had taken. Marlene poked her head in, eyes darting between them, before falling to the floor. "Hiya, McKinnon," James grinned. "Evan's with you?" Sirius rolled his eyes. No." Her voice was a bit higher than usual, reedy with nerves. She fiddled with her hair. "Sirius, can I talk to you?" "Me?" He sat up, brow furrowed in confusion. He'd only ever hung out with McKinnon in groups, and he was pretty sure that he'd never spoken to her directly. He had no idea what she'd want to talk to him about. What is it?" Mary asked me to tell you something." Mary? This was only bewildering him further. Why hadn't Mary just come to speak to him, if she had to say something? "Tell me what?" I don't think I was supposed to say it in front of this lot." Okay." Sirius rose hesitantly and followed her out into the corridor. As the door shut behind them, Marlene twisted her fingers together, refusing to meet his eye. "Well?" "Mary," Marlene paused, taking a deep breath, and then the words came out in a rush. "Mary wanted me to tell you that she's breaking up with you." Sirius had never been so baffled in his life. Breaking up with him? When had she started going out with him? Marlene was still talking, looking very guilty. "She's got a new boyfriend, and she thought it would be best to let you know before anything became too serious." There was an awkward pause, then, almost as an afterthought, "Sorry." It's fine, Marlene. Really." He trailed off, not sure what to say. When she continued to hover, he cleared his throat. I'll see you at dinner, yeah?" "Oh, yes. Right, okay." Marlene nodded sharply, looking relieved by the dismissal, and hurried back off to her own carriage. Sirius rejoined his friends, still feeling perplexed as he sat down. "Well?" "Mary's got a boyfriend, apparently," Sirius said, still trying to process what had just happened. "You mean you got dumped?" "Well, I don't know." He scratched his head. "Was I going out with her?" "Well, apparently she thought you were." Sirius groaned in frustration. Why don't girls just say what they mean? He had no recollection of ever agreeing to be Mary's boyfriend, or whatever. James nodded sympathetically. "Girls are a nightmare," he said solemnly. Sirius leaned back in his seat, wondering if he should be upset. But mostly he was just relieved. At least now he finally knew where things stood with Mary, even if he wasn't entirely sure how they got there. Saturday the 6th of January, 1974. Mary no longer sat with him at dinner, and she stopped coming to watch Marlene during the Gryffindor practices. She still was perfectly friendly with them when they passed the halls, or saw each other in class, but apparently most of the things that Sirius had taken to be signs of their growing friendship were no longer appropriate now that Mary had a boyfriend. The suddenness at which the change had come had perturbed him, It wasn't that he missed Mary, even though he'd liked her. Sirius had always felt a bit ambivalent about having her hanging around. And he had more than enough time, and he had more than enough to keep him busy with the marauders. But it was still unsettling to realise just how little he'd understood about the situation. Had he and Mary actually been dating? Had he been her boyfriend? Or had everyone else realised? Why hadn't she talked to him about it? Shouldn't she have said something? Was he supposed to have just understood? Was that normal? When had that started? Did kissing her cheek make her his girlfriend? And if they were going out, then why hadn't she said anything? And was it normal? Then how was Sirius supposed to ever tell the difference between girls who were just friends and girls who were, well, not friends? He discussed it with James, comparing notes from his experience with Mary and the things his friend had heard from the older boys on the Quidditch team. "Seems it mostly just comes down to snogging," James whispered, knowledgeably. They'd cast a silencing spell around the bed. Remus and Peter were asleep, but they were still speaking in low voices, a forced habit. "What? So once you snog a girl, then she's your girlfriend?" "Well, no, I don't know. They didn't say exactly. You can just snog a girl without wanting to date her, though, I think." Sirius groaned, flopping back onto the mattress. "I didn't even snog Mary. How am I supposed to know if she dumped me?" "I mean, it definitely seems like she dumped you, mate." Sirius glared at him, and James hurriedly looked back to the subject at hand. "Anyway, I thought you kissed her cheek." "Yeah, but that's not snogging." "Suppose not. I wonder if Evans would let me kiss her cheek." Sirius snorted. "Fat chuds." James threw a pillow at him. Unfortunately, no matter how they looked at it, the situation with Mary remained a mystery. Sirius sighed in frustration, complaining, "Why couldn't she have just told me we were going out? It's like they all speak some kind of bloody code." James nodded, looking thoughtful. "Yeah. Do you think that means that maybe Evans—" "No, Potter." By the end of their first week back, Sirius had accepted the fact that some things in life, such as girls, would just have to remain a mystery, at least for the moment. Unlike James, who continued to act a fool whenever Lily was near, Sirius decided that he had had quite enough of girls for the time being. Now that he'd, maybe, had a sort of girlfriend, he really didn't see what all the fuss was about. The only marauder who truly seemed comfortable around the fairer sex was Remus, who, as promised, had re-entered his study group with Lily, Marlene and Mary, and sit near the marauders at meals just to chat with Remus about their classes. Sirius had no idea how their friend could act so casual around them when the marauders all knew now that at any moment a girl who you thought just wanted to be friends with you could actually turn everything around and make you think that she fancied you, and then dump you within a month before you had even had time to figure out you were dating. Sirius wondered if he should warn Remus that spending time with girls and chattering with them wasn't the same thing as it was with boys. It could very quickly lead to something more insidious before you even knew it. But he had a feeling that Remus would not appreciate his advice, since the taller boy continued to insist whenever they teased him about girls that they were just friends and nothing more. Still, Sirius watched carefully, trying to hone in on his observational skills for the future. He found himself watching Lupin as he walked with Mary and Marlene to the library, or as he chatted with Lily at lunch, narrowing his eyes and trying to crack whatever secret code the girls used to show that they fancied someone. Remus might think they were just friends, but that didn't mean the girls wouldn't go getting any ideas. Other than this newfound wariness, however, everything appeared to be entirely normal with the marauders, which was why, the first week of the new term, Remus made a proclamation that took Sirius completely by surprise. He, James and Peter were returning from a detention. They charmed the toilets in the dungeon to spit high-speed streams of water at any students who walked into the bathrooms, which was mostly meant to get the Slytherins, although there were a few unfortunate Ravenclaws who had been doused after potions lesson. When they opened the door to their room, Remus was lying in bed, fully dressed and staring off into space. He sat up as they came in. "I've had a think," he started. "Oh, no wonder you need to lie down," Sirius interrupted, not about to let the opportunity go to waste. Remus chucked a pillow at him. "Oh, piss off, I'm serious." "No, I'm serious." James smacked him on the back of the head, making him wince. "Shut up, Black." Thanks. Remus shot James a grateful smile. The old animagus thing. Yeah? Sirius, who had been rubbing the back of his poor head, perked up. Had an idea? I love moony ideas. Not exactly. Remus frowned at his bedspread, looking very uncomfortable. After a short pause, he said slowly, I don't want you to do it. Sirius froze. What? Do what? Peter asked, not following. It was James who answered. He doesn't want us to become animagi. He looked at Remus for confirmation. Is that right? Remus nodded, once, firmly. I'm really grateful, I am. I don't think you really understand how dangerous it would be. I could hurt you. I could kill you. I've got no control over it. No, that wasn't fair. He'd already said yes. Sirius couldn't believe Remus was trying to take it back. He'd always overthought everything, getting so worked up when he had no reason to. But it's going to work, Sirius burst out, trying to rein in his anger. I did all the research. James, did you show him? Leave it, mate, James said. It's Lupin's decision. Sirius bit his tongue, fuming. Thanks. Remus smiled at James. He had a worried, guilty look in his eye, which only frustrated Sirius more. He wanted to protest again, but James fixed him with a stern look. We can talk about this later. Sirius huffed, angry with his friends, and sulked off towards his bed for the rest of the evening. Remus was clearly upset about something, and Sirius didn't want to make him feel worse, even though it was probably something stupid. Moony might act like he was some sort of dangerous monster, but Sirius knew that he'd never hurt them. He just knew it. Later, after lights out, Sirius crept over to James's bed. Potter pulled back the curtain as if he'd been expecting him, waiting until he settled to cast a silencing spell. The moment it was up, Sirius spoke. We're still doing it. Sirius. I don't care. Remus can mope about all he wants, but he can't stop us from becoming animagi. Black, he's not stopping us. James looked troubled. He's asking us not to, as his friends. Well, as his friend, I'm still going to become an animagus. Come on, Sirius. He's obviously thought about this a lot. What if you became animagus, and he really did end up hurting you? Would you want to make him live with that on his conscience? He wouldn't hurt us. But if he did, I don't care. He's already hurting himself. Do you want us to live with that on our consciences, knowing that there's something we could have done to help him? Sirius had knotted his fingers into fists without realizing it. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. He appeared to be considering it for a moment, obviously torn by the moral quandary. Look, Lupin's clearly upset about something, okay? Let's just give him a little bit of time. Maybe he'll change his mind again. Sirius opened his mouth to protest, but James held a hand up, talking over him. And if he doesn't, well, then we'll talk about it, okay? Just give him some time first. Sirius huffed, but he knew that James was being responsible. Remus was prone to fits of melancholy. Maybe he really would change his mind. Reluctantly, Sirius agreed to give things some more time before they decided whether to move forward with their project. James seemed relieved, lifting the silencing spell and pulling back the curtain so that Sirius could creep back to his own bed. But as Sirius lay awake, listening to the even breathing of his friends, his resolve hardened. He had told James that he would give Moony some time, and he would, but Sirius knew that he was going to become an animagus. Nothing would stop him, not even Remus's attempts to martyr himself. Just wait, he thought, drifting between sleep and consciousness. I'm going to prove you all wrong.